Irreducible complexity is the recognition that many systems need multiple parts in order to perform their function. In Darwin's black box, as an illustration of that idea, I talked about a mousetrap, just a simple mechanical mousetrap that you can get at a hardware store. A mousetrap has a number of parts. It's got a spring and it's got a wooden platform that it attaches to, and it's got a part called the hammer, which squashes the mouse, and several other parts too. And it also has little staples that hold those parts onto the wooden platform too. And those staples have to be placed at just the right points, or else the parts would not be adjusted, would not be in the right orientation to do their job. And if you took one of those parts away, or you changed it so it didn't fit with the other ones, the whole system would not work. It would no longer function as a mousetrap. So that's irreducible complexity. It's complex because it has a number of parts, and it's irreducible because if you take some of the parts away, the system doesn't work. Now, I argued in Darwin's black box that those systems, irreducibly complex systems, are very big obstacles to Darwinian evolution, because Darwin's mechanism of random changes and natural selection needs for a system to be working as it is built up step by very tiny step. But if you have something like a mousetrap, how can you build that gradually, step by step? If you start with a wooden base, it doesn't have a mousetrap function. And if you go add a part, it still doesn't have the mousetrap function. And so there would be nothing for natural selection to select. Well, some people didn't like this idea of irreducible complexity, and they said, but maybe the parts could be used for something else, and the function could change along the way and get to a mousetrap. And a man who made this argument is a professor of biology at Brown University named Ken Miller. And he said, well, sure, you can't make a mousetrap all at once, but suppose you took that mousetrap. If you took off a part, you couldn't use it as a mousetrap, but he said you could use it as a tie clip. If you took off the holding bar that stabilizes the holder until a mouse comes along, it snaps shut immediately, but hey, you can use it for your tie as a tie clip. And you can use the base just as a paperweight, and so on. So maybe those things arose, in the analogy, maybe those parts arose for a different purpose, and then at the end it became a mousetrap. And that's an interesting idea, but the concept of irreducible complexity does not say you can't use the parts for any other purpose. It says that the function of the entire system, the mousetrapping function, is destroyed if you take away one of the parts. Sure, you could use the spring perhaps in something else, but the spring alone does not trap a mouse. What's worse is that the scenario of starting out with one function and going to another and going to another is being guided by the imagination of the scientist, or Ken Miller in this instance. He says, what do we need to get to a mousetrap? Well, let's start with this, and let's add this, and we can turn this way and turn that way. But he is intelligently guiding the process. If you look at images of paperweights on, say, the internet, you won't see anything like the little platform that's used in mousetraps. And if you look at springs on the internet, very few of them will be the shape, the exact shape you need for a mousetrap. And if you look at tie clips on the internet, you won't find anything that looks like a mousetrap, unless you see a picture of Ken Miller with a mousetrap on his tie, and there's a few of those on the internet. So as a matter of fact, if you were trying to, or if you wanted a paperweight and you changed it and selected the best paperweight or the best tie clip at the stages where you were developing that, you would develop it into a very different structure than the one you need for a mousetrap. So you have to be very careful in these things, because it's easy to fool yourself that nature would take the mind that you, as an intelligent being, would see from one state to another. And people have used the same argument for some of the biochemical examples of irreducible complexity that I wrote about in Darwin's Black Box. In one example, I wrote about the bacterial flagellum, which is literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's got a number of mechanical parts. It's got a propeller and a drive shaft and a motor and clamps to hook it onto the bacterial membrane, and many others. And I said it was irreducibly complex. And again, Ken Miller, who has been a vocal critic of intelligent design, said, well, yes, but a couple years after Darwin's Black Box came out, another system was discovered that was very similar in some respects to the bacterial flagellum. And it had much of the machinery at the base of the flagellum, but it was actually used to inject proteins, poisonous proteins, from a predator bacterium into a prey bacterium, because they have to eat too, and some of them eat other bacteria, and they inject poison proteins that kill the bacteria, and then the predator consumes it. And the base of that looked reminiscent of the flagellum. And so the argument was, I had said that the flagellum was irreducible. You take away a part and it loses its function. But hey, here we have a simplified version of it, and it works very nicely as this injector. And that argument confuses a number of points. First of all, again, irreducible complexity doesn't say you can't use parts or subsets of parts for another purpose. It says if you take away one of the parts of a system, it can't function as it did before. And the reduced system cannot function as an outboard motor like the flagellum does. The second thing is that doesn't explain where anything came from. It doesn't explain how the injector developed step by step in a Darwinian fashion. It doesn't explain, if you had an injector, how would you get to an outboard motor step by tiny step. Each of those is a horrendously difficult problem. And so it's essentially saying that this looks similar to that, so hey, maybe Darwinian processes could go from one to the other. But unfortunately, that's just an imaginative exercise, and there is no evidence that it could go even a tiny step of the way from one to the other. So it turns out that the problem of irreducible complexity that I discussed in 1996 is still a huge obstacle to Darwinian evolution. None of the examples that I wrote about in the book have been even addressed, really, in serious scientific publications. You can find some, skeptical articles on the internet or something, but in serious scientific publications, nobody has tried to explain how Darwinian processes could make the flagellum or the blood clotting cascade or intracellular transport or any of the examples. And folks who say that it's no longer a problem are just consoling themselves with very weak responses from some proponents of Darwin's theory. But in reality, the problem has not gone away, and it's not going to go away.